So welcome everyone, welcome back. This is such a dream come true to sit with them and you guys all here. Just amazing. I mean, we never thought we would come to this point, especially being through this pandemic of what has gotten us this far, but also to every COVID survivor, wherever you are, that I'm not sure if any of you had COVID, but just to recognize everything that we've been through to be here, just amazing. Thank you. And as we think about the pandemic and as a planning committee went round and round about what we were going to do and if we were going to have an opportunity to gather in person and for you all to be here, it's just such an honor. And so my first question to all of you is, the work that you were doing before the pandemic and then going through, navigating through the pandemic, has it changed your work? Has it brought you closer to your community? Or what are some insights that, as you reflect, now that we're still in a pandemic, where is this taking you? Or what are those revelations? We talk about the ancestral prophecies. We talk about adapting and sustainability, all of these different things. Is there anything that stands out to all of you in particular? And we'll start with Bev, and then if I can call you by your first name too, I really want to say like Chef Nephi Craig and Mr. Michael. Okay, Bev and Nephi, and then Michael.
Well, for me, of course, I already mentioned that I'm technologically needy, and I don't mind admitting that, but I did learn how to do Zoom from home. I had to. So when you think you can't do it, and then there comes a time when you have to, you usually can, right? And so that was one thing. And then we had to find innovative ways to reach our students because we were very close to our students. Like, for instance, I have 14 nursing majors. They're all in the process of becoming a registered nurse. And part of what we did was talking circles for them. Besides the monthly meetings for the mentorship. And then of course, we always shared our cell phone numbers with the students, because in order to be Lakota in the way that we think of as being Native, Indigenous, is to be in an extended family mindset and to be available. And I'm known as Unchi by my students. They call me grandmother. And that gives me that added responsibility to be available to them 24/7. And so I was, and they knew it. But they were all very, very respectful. They usually text me in the morning and say, when can you talk? So that was fine. But we also created a talking circle on Zoom. And that I thought, that is really unique, because talking circle is very intimate and you're facing each other at the same level and you're sitting in a circle and sharing. But we had to do something to bring them together, if at all possible. And they did. And when they did, they brought forth fears of what was going to happen to them in their process of getting their baccalaureate in nursing. So that's the type of thing that we came up with, and it did bring us closer because we were all in the same boat. We were all facing the same fears, but as the OG of the group, I had to be the strong one, and I can do that very easily because I've been around long enough, and these are young people who have not necessarily experienced too many things in their lives yet, but they would be. And part of my purpose there is to teach them something about strength and resiliency, all the values that I mentioned, to try to teach something cultural every time. And I don't mind doing that either. And so through that process, the students did mention, all of them, that they became stronger during that time because of our availability to them. So that was part of my experience.
That's really amazing. And I'm a student at the University of Oklahoma School of Law, and that was the first thing my instructor said. It's like, here's my cell phone. And I was like, how is this happening? Like, they're so intentional about connecting with us and to make more availability out of your busy schedule already and reaching our students and having the love to teach. I mean, I hope, everyone feels that love and is feeling that there is the connection that needs to be made. And that's just amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And also, I always say we're the generation of baby Zoomers. And there's still probably some that are still learning. So thank you, Bev, for sharing that. Nephi?
What I learned from the pandemic and during the pandemic was that for me personally, knowing the right words wasn't enough. Like, I can define self-care, I can define different ways to take care of myself and what I should do. But when the isolation of being quarantined or being really kind of isolated in early 2020 was happening, I realized that I needed connectivity. I needed to connect with people. And we were fortunate in Arizona to be able to really shift and maneuver our outreach efforts with the recovery work we do into telehealth. And so opening up the realm of telehealth was really valuable, I think, for that connectivity, because at least for me, I learned that I couldn't just understand and say the right things, the action had to back it up. So I learned that I could run, I could learn that I could cook more. I did, live Instagram cooking demos and stuff like that, just to maintain my own mental health. And I really realized how important that was. So that's what I kind of carry into the to this point in time, is really encouraging others to continue to follow that pursuit, or to practice what we talk. That's what I learned.
And also Cafe Goujon has taken its own journey. Do you want to talk about that too?
Yeah, well, we weathered the pandemic, and we opened really briefly right before it all happened, and then we shut down for like a whole year, and our team went into other areas. And so then we reopened, and we shut down twice since we opened again. So it's really about adapting to what life is throwing us. And we have that ability as Native peoples, and we have that ability, we're used to it, but it's been a really neat journey, and it's a really cool spot. Yeah.
Wow. We hope to all visit there one day and to eat with you, because you're always cooking something so delicious. Michael?
Yeah, the pandemic for me was really an interesting time, because it was a pandemic, still a pandemic. Believe it or not, COVID's still here, mutating, and we're looking at monkeypox now, right? So part of my background has been in global health. And when I did my PhD, I studied American Indian health, and did this big national survey. But I got to understand a bit about what Nephi is talking about too, is our flexibility and our capacity to adapt to difficult situations and circumstances. And my community, I happen to be the dean of the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. It's a big faculty. We've got faculty in the northern Manitoba. We've got faculty in the inner city. We've got a Master of Social Work and Indigenous Knowledges. And then we've got our main campus at Fort Garry. So a lot of faculty, a lot of students. And what I found out in our community was that it was very difficult, like Nephi is saying, I think, because folks had this want to kind of, at first, everything was okay because they didn't have to go to school, but after a while they began to really suffer because of the lack of connection with others. And so mental health issues really turned out to be big. And one of the things that I did with two other colleagues was to put on mindfulness moments. I'm a mindfulness teacher, so we were doing that to teach folks about mindfulness and how to meditate, and stress and that kind of thing. It's not easy to do because most people's mind continues to focus and function, and there's a lot of anxiety to overcome. And so it taught me a lot about the world, the Western world we live in, where there's the contemplation capacities we have don't really exist for a lot of people. And that's why so many people flock to mindfulness these days, to kind of learn the skills of how to kind of temper down their anxiety and their depression and their mood disorders because of everyday kinds of things. And food, of course, is certainly one of those things that played a part of it. Of course, violence in the home kind of began to uptick, and depression, a lot of depression, and a couple suicides, and just those kinds of things. So it was interesting to kind of understand at that point, what we needed to do. And I think that I still think one of the really important things to do is to begin to teach children at a very early age contemplative practices. We know that, like Nephi said, how do we adapt to things? We've got this beautiful brain that has what we call plasticity, neuroplasticity. And the more that we can feed that brain the right positive messages and teach kids how to focus on their breath, to kind of quiet down some of the anxiety, within a generation, you can see a very, very tremendous change in a society as people begin to kind of take on those different capacities to center themselves and to find more compassion for themselves and others and that sort of thing. So that's what I learned about the community. And my own community back in North Dakota, they got hit hard. Everybody was catching COVID left and right, and I lost a number of relatives. There was a lot of COVID deniers among Native people. Saw a lot of chatter out there, people, talking about that. But the bright side of all that too was that, it showed me, what can happen when you get people to work together and cooperate. You had scientists from around the world come up with a vaccine, something that people have done before. So that kind of cooperation showed me that, in our larger community, how the necessity there, is so important to kind of work together to do that kind of thing. And in Canada, the first, I think like in the States too, the first priority were First Nation people for the vaccine, because they didn't want to repeat the thing about, people not getting vaccines. So it's still like that. People are getting their fourth dose, and they've lowered it down to First Nation people getting their fourth dose can be 30 years of age. So.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think one thing that connects the three of you is that talking about the neuroplasticity. It's something that I've been hearing Chef Nephi talk about through the webinars, and how important it is to have new experiences to heighten our liveliness, and also just its medicine to our survival. And so it's just interesting to have all of you three here talking about that. And I know through the pandemic, it was really critical that we've seen the resurgence of an Indigenous activity and advocacy, and all of these different important works. And at our organization at Diné Community Advocacy Alliance, we say, Shana Danigligo as and that means let's live a long life. And suddenly we came to this point of survival and trying to adapt. And our ancestors, they adapted, they were survivalists, but we're still trying to figure it out. And we're still trying to address the nutritional trauma. There was a lot of different discussion about what was being delivered to our tribal communities during this time, and many of it was unhealthy food, Ian visual. And so for the three of you, how do we address that? How do we bring balance and talk about and address the unhealthy food in our communities? Because in many of our communities, there is nothing but chips, candy, and soda. There is the unhealthy food, but then we don't have access to our own foods at many points. How do we bring a balance to that? What is your message or strategy, or what would you like to say, to help our communities to eat healthier or healthful, to have those wild foods, or to be able to contribute to our food system to make it a resilient and strong one?
I think my work situation is ideal to do that, because all of our Native student nurses want to do this. They're finding their way to make it better for future generations. And we talk about it all the time. What is it that you can do as a nurse? Because you're going to be powerful as a nurse. People are going to listen to you. And you can teach so many things. Whatever is your passion, you can teach. And you can go into different fields to do that. You can become a pediatric nurse and teach the little ones about proper eating and what it means, what it does to your body, and remind them on the spirituality part that we call our children Wakanja. It means sacred ones. And so we talk about that. Why is it that we call them the sacred ones? And we need to let them know that we call them because they are. And when they realize this is how we view them, think of what it does for them. Think of what it does for their self-worth, the self-esteem, because so many times those are at a low ebb as Native children. And so talk about what you know in your culture, how we view children. And the student nurses, so I guide them in terms of working as a public health nurse, for instance. Think about that. That's such a great opportunity. I did that in Arizona for 7 years as a public health nurse on one of the reservations. And that's teaching whole families or extended families and all the health teaching you do anyway. You can put an emphasis on nutrition. There's so many ways to teach the children and the whole families. Is the way I talk to my students is, or if you want to work in the hospital setting and you're doing discharge planning, bring some cultural aspects to what you teach. Have some handouts for them about buffalo meat and how it's so low in fat. And if the tribe provides buffalo meat, you don't have to go buy beef, and so there's different ways by knowing your community to guide your whoever it is that you're trying to help or teach. So as a mentor, I do have an opportunity that I do it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's very powerful. And, we say we're holy beings, the sacredness about who we are. And that's why I think it's critical we address, what we're putting in our bodies and what we're drinking. It's important. And we continue to emphasize that, to acknowledge the children, acknowledge each other as holy beings. And so thank you for sharing that, Nephi.
I always use the term expanding food vocabulary. I think like being able to identify indigenous cultivars in our class earlier today, we talked about making the difference or defining the difference in each of our communities, what's indigenous, what's traditional foods, because when we say traditional foods, we all kind of go to those grandma recipes, mom recipes, those traditional foods that are really recognizable. And a lot of those might be flour, beef, chicken, lard kind of based, or that kind of stem from the reservation era or commodity food era. They have nostalgic value. I'm not saying dismiss them and get rid of them forever. They're a part of our legacy. They're a part of our history. They're a part of our resilience. When you can define traditional foods and then define indigenous foods, and that opens up a wide array of indigenous cultivars. And I feel like being able to teach how to prepare some of the foods and be approachable with it, I feel like is really important. We talked in our classes earlier, just like trying not to get I try not to get too chefy with it. You know what I mean? Like when I do a class, I want to cook and present a meal that I want to, again, like validate other people's experiences. Because it's just like that cartoon Ratatouille, like anyone can cook, right? And so it's like meeting people where they're at and presenting new information and letting them decide for themselves. Food access and food accessibility in our communities is another big issue, but I think starting with understanding what's indigenous foods and some of the food history is really valuable. At least in my experience, it has been.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And we celebrated our 10th anniversary for DCA, and we had this Let's Eat In campaign and challenge. So for 10 days, let's eat in, let's eat indigenous.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to change that because at first we're like, no crap, no carbonated, refined, artificial processed foods. But we realize, and Chef Brian Yazzie always speaks to this too, is that we know that our people don't have access to indigenous foods, but maybe what local foods can they have? And the whole point of the challenge was to eat in and to cook together and to bring sovereignty to the kitchen table to be able to facilitate that experience. And so when we say let's eat in, let's eat indigenous, it was speaking to that, those cultivars that you were talking about. And how do we balance that? How do we create, these opportunities despite a lack of opportunities? And I think that's where the blessing and the prayers are answered, because we're trying to find the intersectionalities, but also the solutions of moving forward. So thank you for sharing that. Michael?
Yeah, I think it's quite a struggle to change the dietary habits of indigenous folks. I think we live in a world that's controlled and by major agricultural food companies and corporations. I think there's like about 9 companies that manage about 80% of the food that we eat. I'm not quite sure that those numbers, but it's huge when you think about that. And a conference like this, is important because it has a lot of information. But one of the things we don't know enough about, we should learn about, is the power of those corporations to get us to eat their food. They spend billions and billions and billions of dollars getting people addicted to their food. And they've got all these marketing ploys and, to get us to eat more sugar, salt, and fat, right? Those foods are laced with a lot of pesticides, a lot of herbicides, a lot of fungicides, and Congress and the political leaders they work a lot with these food companies. They allow things like trans fats in your food, even though it says 0 trans fats on the package you're eating, you're getting trans fats. You're going to go to any restaurant, you're going to get hydrogenated oils yet, which are, cause heart disease and Alzheimer's. You're still going to get those kinds of things as product. And those are available to people who can't afford the higher expensive organic brands. So it's a question of trying to change the I guess the attitudes and making people responsible that are controlling your food choices. That's first of all. I mean, how do you deal with corporations that have so much power, right? I mean, 10-day challenge, to eat indigenous in 255 days, you eat, from the sort of the menu out there and that sort of thing. It's quite a challenge. But I think the thing is to educate children about that, right? To educate kids about, being colonized and about, how those foods work against them and who controls what they eat. It has to kind of, I think, be taught to people. I mean, imagine if you were to teach kids about every month they eat a credit card worth of plastic. That's about what we eat. If we eat foods, microplastics are in all our foods these days. We've got plastic bottles we're drinking out of right now. It's a lot of plastic. The ocean fish now are full of plastics, sardines, everything to salmon and tuna. And, we're just sort of marinating in these different kinds of things. Our water quality is very low. You've got all kinds of personal products people are flushing down antidepressants and anxiety medications into the water. We're drinking that water. You can't filter that water enough anymore, right? And so, we just live in this place where we're kind of at the edge of the precipice before we do what ecologists call collapse, overshoot and collapse. We've overshot our ability to feed ourselves in a healthy way because there's so many of us, population's growing, and so society's collapsing, the food system's collapsing, financial systems are collapsing. Markets are collapsing. A pandemic has made things even worse. But I think that's the key thing is education, to educate people about that. I mean, folks are returning back to school, starting where they left off. There's nobody talking about the pandemics in the schools and the pandemic that rose and they're rising because of human beings' encroachment into these areas that are very delicate areas that are going to release more and more viruses. I mean, pandemics haven't gone away. People like Laurie Garrett, who wrote the book, The Next Plague or The Coming Plague, people have been talking about this for years. So we're going to see more, but I think that's the thing, is to educate as much as we can young people about that and to the sense of urgency that they need to understand that we need to make these changes. They have to have a macro sort of look at the world, a supra look at the world to kind of see all these systems in play and kind of have a big picture, then they can filter it all the way down. I don't believe in food deserts. I don't believe them at all. I've seen a lot of old grandmas scratch out a piece of land, wherever it was, and they created it there. I know that for food, you can plant seeds in a bale of hay and it's going to produce, vegetables. So I think it's that creativity. There was a guy by the name of Ron Finley, who maybe you've heard of that guy, the guerrilla gardener, down in South Central LA. It's like he said, one of the things he said, how do you get kids to eat healthy? He said, his experience is if kids grow broccoli, kids eat broccoli. Kids grow kale, they eat kale. And that's kind of taking them, right to the source. Otherwise you have to compete against all these companies, right? Chips, soda, all these things, these packaging, commercials on all the time. It's very, very difficult. So I think it comes down to kind of figuring out a plan at that point. So.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And, we were designed to be attracted to those colorful foods. And yet when we go in the store, all of the items and packages are those colorful items. And when we're attracted to that, we naturally see, the yellow and the purple and the orange and different things. And so even science has figured, that out on our behalf to try to want those chips and candy and soda. And I'm glad you brought up, the food desert thing, because many people are still using that terminology, and a desert's an ecosystem. And so we don't want to be using, that terminology and saying, there is a food desert. And so also one of the things, that really stands out is now navigating how we are educating our young people. So we work with Berkeley Media Studies on target marketing, and we see it. In my community of Shiprock, New Mexico, we can see a Native girl behind, I don't want to say the company, behind this company, and we see her modeling the unhealthy drinks. And we see target marketing. It took us 1 year for our organization to reclaim one billboard. We should have access to our tribal billboards, right? And how do we educate, and how do we help our people to understand even the impacts, like you had mentioned, and like you said, the power of sugar as well, and what are in our foods. I've been to Kenya and different parts of the world to study about this sugar cartels and the harm that it brings to the communities, the deaths that it creates, really emphasizing the education to educate our people to be able to understand beyond what they see with the unhealthy food. So thank you for this discussion. And so as we go to Pigeonhole, there is a question that has come up on the screen here. There's crossover between food sovereignty and reclaiming traditional foods and being queer, trans, two-spirits. Can you talk about the ways in which it's necessary to include two-spirits in this work?
Well, I was looking at that question. I thought that's a really interesting question. And I would go back to traditional values. There's a certain, this is what I'm talking about, is Lakota way that I was taught. And that there's no judgment with people. And we talk about the two spirits. And part of what I teach, of course, with students who have questions, who have confusion, and trying to do it in a traditional way approach, because all my students are Lakota. And so I can do this very easily. And I talk about the fact that why do we call them two spirits? It's because they have male and female spirits. What does that tell you? They're doubly powerful. It's like somebody who has more than one culture. Sometimes little children are made fun of if they have more than one culture. And so you could teach that level of students as well, that they're doubly gifted because they have two spirits and we have one. It's kind of an approach that way of acceptance and non-judgmental. And so by starting with a traditional way of thinking, there's so much you could do with this type of a dilemma. Even the word disability. There's no word usually in indigenous languages for disability because everybody was accepted at the level they are. And so in South Dakota, one of my sons works with disability among Native communities in the state, and they had to come up with a word, disability, that everybody would understand. And it was finding their way or finding their place. Because if you're immobile, because you're in a wheelchair, you can find a way to find employment with training. Or if you have a learning disability, there's a way to find your way to work in whatever you can do. So it's part of the beauty of being an Indigenous is our traditional beliefs. And that's why we're all very resilient to change. We haven't changed our basic who we are because of that resiliency and hanging on to it for dear life. And I look at this group and I have so much hope because I see a lot of young people here wanting to learn and share and be collaborative in your outreach.
Sharing that, and it is important and our young people and all of our people want to be embraced too. And it's just important how we need to share that knowledge and wisdom with love and joy and respect, like you have mentioned through your presentation. Thank you. Nephi?
I think like there's a term we use in recovery circles where it's principles before personalities, and inclusion is a big part of this. And the narrative and the story and histories of how the term like Two-Spirit emerges and has become more commonplace is an example of how accepting we all are now today. A few generations ago, it was very probably dangerous to have these kind of conversations. And so now I think it's just an example of how we're evolving as a culture and a society, and we're reclaiming that emotional intelligence and sentiment around that, around around Two-Spirit individuals, because again, validating the experience of that life, of their lives, is very real. You know, I'm not dismissing it, but including it into the narratives and weaving and understanding that is very powerful. So that's kind of how I see that overlap, because it is very important. In my life as a cook, traditionally they say, cooking is for girls or women, and you know what I mean? So kind of walk that line too of how the gender roles play can be damaging, you know what I mean? So I think it's an ongoing question that we're going to continue to address, and it's another exciting part of our history. So
we've seen a lot of work right through this pandemic of more diversity, equity, inclusion, justice groups, and advocating and educating and increasing awareness of biodiversity. And so I think we'll see more of that. Michael?
Yeah, I think it is a question of inclusion, EDI, like equity, diversity, and inclusion, to bring all experiences, all walks of life, all intelligences into a conversation to cooperate to solve a problem. And in this case, the crossover between food sovereignty and reclaiming traditional foods, is pretty clear, pretty clear. How do we do that, right? We do that with trying to bring in, like I said, folks who have different experiences, different sort of pathways, and understanding the capacities, the intelligence, the talents, the skills that they have to do this, and look at it from a strengths-based perspective, and I think that's how we solve problems, is by bringing in a much wider circle of thinkers, create these kind of moving think tanks or tribal critical thinking centers in the community where you involve everyone, and that's so important to be doing. So I think that's the crossover, whether it's Two-Spirit, whether it's children, whether it's elders, whether it's tribal leaders, whatever. I think it's that synergy that you get from that experience that comes in to help solve the problem.
Thank you. We're unfortunately out of time, but please take a moment. One more question? Okay, we have more time. How do we get our youth, teens interested in a traditional diet or to eat healthy with so many unhealthy options?
Well, I've had experience on the reservation when I worked in Arizona with doing garden projects in the schools. And in that process of creating a garden, teaching everything that you can along the way regarding nutrition. And as public health nurses, we were involved with that project. And it was a long time in planning. And the schools had to agree to it, of course, and then a curriculum had to be developed. But the curriculums are out there. I think some of you may know already of curriculums for developmental phases of a child, and you can implement those curriculums to teach about the very basics about healthy foods. And in that process, you're going to find some children who take to it and find passion for it. So, and it's if a school is cooperative, you can do it with that process.
I got teenagers and 2 little kids, and so this is a question that makes me smile, you know, because I think I always say season your food with laughter, humor, and teach with enthusiasm. I think making indigenous foodways cool and accessible and visible. We see it happening already. It's across social media in different realms where we see old school, like, 80s, 90s graffiti art transforming into indigenous art, where we're making our stories and narratives visible on tanks and buildings. And we see that kind of making wellness and health culture cool. I feel like that's one way that we can really kind of gravitate in, because that's the language we speak. And I think for a lot of the populations and the demographic of the youth, most of the teens right now, their parents are like my age, right? We grew up in the 80s, 90s, right? So we know what's cool. Everything that's cool today is built on the coolness of the 80s and 90s, right? So we have that intuitive sense to reach that demographic and kind of know the boundaries of what's cool and corny. Well, hopefully we do, right? But make it accessible, make it creative, and make it fun. I think that's really important. And like Michael said, if kids grow broccoli, they'll eat broccoli. And same thing with the cooking. If kids cook 3 sisters, they'll eat 3 sisters. So that kind of thing is, I think, hands-on and behavioral activated, fun.
Thank you, Chef Nephi. Who's corny and who's cool? And who's cooking? Michael?
Yeah, I think it's a really challenging question. It's an interesting question. I don't want to. Sounds like all my answers are like pathological. I'm talking about, So, but I did want to make a point though that it's really important to teach youth about their bodies. Really, to dig down deep to teach them about their bodies. All aspects of their bodies, and of course how the bodies work. One of the difficulties in trying to get kids to change is not only the manufacturing or the availability of really low quality, high processed foods, but also if they learn about their human microbiome. It's very important. One of the things we know from the research in studies on the microbiome is that when you eat a lot of sugar or fast foods or refined carbohydrates, you're going to grow populations of bacteria in your gut that are going to want to live off of more sugar, more carbohydrates. That's pretty clear. That's really clear in the science. If you've heard the term hangry, you're hungry and angry, you're probably a sugar eater with a lot of carbs. You eat a lot of carbs, unhealthy carbs. You have a lot of probably inflammatory bacteria living in your guts. That's what happens to kids. Those little boys and girls in your guts are alive. I call it the great circle of life. They're alive. There's a diversity of ecology going on. And they can actually impose upon you or your children a sense of dysphoria, headache, hangry, irritability, until they get they're fed. They produce chemistry and gene talk to yours, to your brain. It says, feed me. Seymour, feed me, right? It's true, they do that. So it's not like a person has the will not to change the diet. And you can change for 10 days, but after 10 days, you want your Frappuccino or your drink, with all the sugar and all the chocolate and those kinds of things, or you want your chips, or you want your, whatever it is, the sweetened foods or cereal. Is that really you wanting that? Partially, but it's also the bacteria inside of your gut that are causing that dysphoria. So it's like a makeover that children need. It takes, it takes many months to begin to completely change over the microbiome or in the gut. It takes a long time. And for some populations of people that, some of the healthy bacteria don't come back. So it's starting kids very, very early on day one, eating, feeding them sweet potatoes and feeding them carrots and feeding them broccoli, and those kinds of things. They develop a taste for that. They don't like it, but they're going to grow the populations in the gut that are going to support eating that kind of food. So it's starting way back there. All the other kinds of plans are good things, but it's really difficult to beat back that bacteria and the manufacturing, and if you want your kids to eat healthy. So, but it can be done. Again, like I said, it's like pathological because it's like an addiction. It really is. The biggest addiction I think we have is not alcohol or substances, but it's eating foods that are very unhealthy for us. And again, it's like the body, and the microbiome adjust to that. When you switch and you finally start moving it back over, then things start to clear up. Pimples go away, your eyesight improves, you sleep better, and so on. So it's like getting kids to really dive deep into understanding, who they are and how their moods and how their bodies and their minds and their actions are controlled, by the food that they eat.
Thank you for sharing that. And much of our health is dependent on our gut. Whatever's going on here is going on everywhere else. And thinking what we're thinking and being hangry, it's real. This is transparency here. And thank you for sharing that. And as we think about how we detox, and you talked about probiotics and using these different methods to be able to improve our microbiome, it's important. And so thank you for also helping us to understand that it's important to help our youth to understand their bodies as young as they are. They're listening and they're watching. They're like sunflowers. The sunflower follows the circadian rhythm, there is following the sun, and they're watching and looking at every one of us continuously. And so as we wrap up the day, before you clap, thank you for this panel. I wish we had all day to talk about these things, but please connect with all of them.